Hello, and welcome to the Tuesday, July 24th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting in the Kubernetes community. Today, I put a couple things at the top of the agenda, just sort of as announcement / FYI. The first is just a reminder to people that we've created a few new repositories for the provider-specific code for the cluster API. So far, we have them for GCP, AWS, and OpenStack. I stuck links to those in the meeting notes, along with links to the test grid for each of them. All three repos not only been created, but also have tests up and running that you can check out in test grid. We just merged a PR to remove all the Google-specific code from the main cluster API repo, and I've got one out to remove the vSphere code as well. So pretty soon the main repo will be provider independent. And then there are two open issues for other repos for Azure and vSphere, and also there's been a discussion about creating a provider SSH repo as well, although I couldn't find an issue for that this morning. So that's just sort of an FYI reminder to people in the SIG that these are sort of SIG-owned repositories, and they're created via lazy consensus voting within the SIG. So as new ones get proposed, we'll go through sort of the voting process for those. Next, I just wanted to briefly mention that the Cluster API project is moving towards an alpha release. The goal is to try and cut one during this next release cycle. And I think the goal is to make it decoupled from cutting the Kubernetes release. And if anybody's interested in helping, we'd love to get help. Tim has a question about whether it's really decoupled. I would say that the mechanics of cutting the release are definitely decoupled, and sort of along the lines of COPS. You know, we'd cut a release with support for specific Kubernetes versions, right? So COPS doesn't cut a release sort of day and date with Kubernetes. They cut one sort of near Kubernetes, right?
So near and discoverability are meta questions. I'm not going to talk to COPS because the near is more far than near. But with our future of Cluster API, discoverability for specific versioning is going to be a thing, right? So how are folks going to manage that for, like, because you have so many different providers, you know, people want the most up-to-date bits for deployment with the latest provider where possible. So, you know, are all providers commonly using kubeadm for deployment to manage the actual control plane aspects, or are they using separate custom deployers? How is this being managed and disseminated so that way there's some level of consistency? Otherwise, I can see this sprawling pretty badly in the future.
Yeah, I think that those are some great issues, and I don't know how much we want to get into it during this meeting versus the meeting on Wednesday. We can certainly have some of the discussion here, although I'm not sure all the stakeholders are in this meeting. Yeah, I think in my mind, the way that the cluster cuddle tool is moving is it would have support for the various providers. So you'd be able to sort of use that one tool to use each of the different providers and have them create and update the cluster for you. And then the question becomes, you know, if you say I want to use provider Google versus say provider AWS, does Cluster Cuddle itself sort of enforce the version of Kubernetes that is supported, and how does it link in sort of the right bits from each of the providers, right?
Even more than that is consistency across providers, right? Like if I am going to say, I want to know that I have a level set bar for all the control plane components as well as the core add-ons, if you want to call it that, because you can't really run it without the core add-ons. Because you want to make sure that there's some level set consistency across this. Security has been enabled by default. These are some of the things that kubeadm does provide. And as long as there's a way to differentiate like an entire metrics of where things are at, I think that way the consumer of the output results or the binary artifacts knows what they're getting themselves into.
I mean,
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Go ahead, Justin.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is not specific to the cloud provider or that component, right? This is the general distro question again, right? Where any tooling that the user ends up using ends up making a decision about like how to choose the set of things that it installs, right? And like COPS is effectively a mini distro in that regard, in that like it bundles a bunch of decisions for you. It's not, that wasn't a deliberate decision, right? But like, and I think but any tooling like cluster CTL will probably make the same sort of decision. I would love to see us come up with a non-tooling specific way to express that, so that like the discoverability problem that Tim says is, and the testing problem, right, which is in my opinion just as bad, like we actually have an answer to that, but we don't really have an answer to that today as far as I know, other than hope that COPS or cluster CTL or whatever it is, or Kubedian, like does all of that work for you.
I think it's definitely a worthwhile topic for tomorrow. I'll be happy to join them too. Because this is a meta problem. Like it's very difficult when people want to have an expectation bar for consistency, and it's kind of very inconsistent across certain things. So as long as whatever we produce has that consistency bar, you know, I think that should be something that we as SIG leads can say that there is a bar for eventually GA. Beta or GA that says, like, you know, we will be at some level set playing field, so that way when we produce something to the consumer, they have a known expectation of what exactly they're getting, right? So if somebody decides to like use provider X, they know that they're always getting core DNS version XYZ, right?
Yeah, I think it's actually a lot of the provider specific stuff is more about the machines and the node configuration, and the control plane and sort of add-on configuration I think would be centralized in the cluster API repo in the cluster cuddle tool, right? So if you use cluster cuddle, you'd expect to get sort of a consistent control plane and consistent core add-ons. And it's really like, how is a node configured? How is a node bootstrapped? How are the machines provisioned, which is the provider specific code. Does that make sense? I think that's,
yeah, but it's widely open for interpretation behind that API.
Yes, no, I agree. And I think that one of the to-dos is to have some sort of conformance, right, type test for the cluster API providers. And we need to figure out what we mean by conformance. Like, what are we trying to validate and verify? How far down does that go? Is it just we can create and delete VMs? Like, is that enough to be conformant? Is it that the VMs have to be secured in a specific way? Do they have to, you know, sort of meet other criteria in terms of what flags are set on the kubelet or any of that sort of thing, right? So I think that that's still TBD.
Just to confirm, the meeting tomorrow is the cluster API meeting, not the Kubedian meeting. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, we talked about this in the cluster API meeting.
Thank you.
All right. Next, Tim, you have a PSA.
Just a reminder, a PSA for those who may not be aware, but the standard operating model that we use for triaging issues within the Kubedian repo, and which is actually beneficial, I think, maybe to be applied across other repos as well, is that we usually defaultly triage and maintain the milestone and have a person who's been active in a specific area defaultly assigned, but that doesn't mean that they are the sole person responsible for that thing. If you have cycles and are interested and want to fix something, if it's not marked as active, feel free to talk with the person who's been assigned and to just take it. The 112 milestone has a lot of work items currently against it, and patches welcome.
Just to clarify, I haven't checked recently. When you say marked as active, is that like a label that gets applied, or are you just?
Yeah, we use a separate label for active, at least within our process for the time being, so that it denotes that somebody's actively working on a patch. And it's applied to the Kubedian repo. It's not applied generally throughout all of KK, but you can just modify it where needed, as long as the folks who are maintainers and who are active contributors already have ACLs to the Kubedian repo to mark it, or should. So there's that.
One thing we found in the cluster API repo is that if you used a label that was kind / whatever string you wanted, you didn't actually have to have ACLs to set labels directly. You could actually do that through the /kind space something. So it might be worth making it kind / active, because then anybody who wants to contribute can like just use the sort of built-in the proud tooling to set them, which is kind of cool.
Is it possible to say like /label active?
It doesn't quite work that well. No, we tried that, and you had to make it kind / something for it to work. Maybe Ben has some more details.
This might be a little kind of off to the side, but there's, from what I remember, there's a system that checks for a set of allowed prefixes as just a simple way to avoid allowing people doing things like labeling approved or something through the label command. But that's certainly something that could be improved, and that label could be one of the things that's whitelisted. If you'd like that, please file an issue against Testinfra.
Yeah, right now, basically, when somebody takes an issue, I go and use label manually. Like, I see that somebody is already active. We may file an issue for this.
Sure.
Yep, I think that would be beneficial. It's just a general workflow that works well in a very distributed environment.
It may also be worth discussing the interaction between active and the issue lifecycle stuff. It might be interesting to have it be aware of that concept, that an issue has been marked active specifically.
So technically active is a life cycle, I guess. It's part of the life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds an awful lot like one to me. It sounds like a more positive one versus the like rotten, stale, etc.
True, right? It goes to sort of assigned to active, right? I think that's the distinction that we're making in the kubeadmin repo that maybe isn't being made elsewhere, right? So it's if people don't just lick the cookie and then walk away and never make progress, and nobody else makes progress either. That if something's not actively working on it, anybody else is free to take it. So
exactly, like we have default assignees, but that assignee may never get to the issue within the given milestone, and if it matters to the consumer or the person who wants to participate, they can absolutely get involved. We want to make sure that that process is clear to all the people who are active contributors.
I'm going to file an issue for this. It should be against Testinfra, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
cool. Next, SIG Charter.
So Lubomir started an issue and copied the template to the doc, and I did a first pass cut through the doc. I think if folks want to have comments, please comment maybe by the end of the week, maybe by next week we do our submission. That gives plenty of time for folks to add comments. It's pretty generic and simple. Some of the pieces that I need help with is basically how to concisely convey scope and out of scope, because the common theme that people typically have for rejection and as part of their charters is that their scope is too broad and their out of scope items are not specific enough. So SIG apps is a perfect example of a charter whose scope is way too broad. So if folks have comments, feedback is solicited.
Well, I've added the in-scope and out-of-scope initial draft, and I honestly don't know what else to do. If somebody else has anything. I've seen some charter PRs rejected because they don't have enough information. Like the first scope sentence for us, perhaps we should extend it into a paragraph of text to provide more detail.
Yeah, basically wordsmiths welcome. Because right now, engineers are typically pretty terse. So
I had a question, Tim. I was trying to follow some of the links from the issue to find the two sort of charters that you said were good that we should be copying, which I believe was auth and node. And I didn't see those submitted, those PRs like submitted. I saw some RFC PRs for those.
There's a spreadsheet. I can link it, community 2065. I'll link that in the doc.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because I was trying to find the canonical ones just to see how ours compared with that. And I couldn't.
I think the updated template is the best one, honestly. The node has been updated too, but the node still includes some of the old language. I know that Derek said he was going to do it, but it looks like he hasn't updated it.
Okay.
I think the biggest thing that is good inside of the node one is the scope boundings. He has some of the old language that we should not copy paste.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to look at least one other example before diving too deep into ours, and I couldn't find one, so I will check that out. Thanks.
So I can submit the PR. Should it be done on Friday or Monday next week?
I think timeout by, what's it called? Timeout by next SIG meeting, and make sure we get the PR in place. So that way it gives us plenty of time, and then we do our last PSA, which says we're going to do the PR, and here's the PR, and you can comment there now.
Do I have to update also the 6.yaml file?
It should be up to date now, currently. If it's not, then we have an issue. You might want to update the sigs.yaml after the charter has been merged.
Yeah, so that we can get a review for the charter doc first. Something about the links at the bottom. We don't use them here in the charter doc, and like we don't have the Zoom meeting in here. And is that a problem?
The Zoom meeting in the charter doc?
Yeah, so basically the charter at the bottom, there's a bunch of links. So this is like a residue from the old template, that the detailed one. And we basically, the charter, we don't have like the test grid link, the Zoom link, and some of these links are non-active, basically. So my point is, I was wondering if we should like link from the charter using these links, or basically link to the YAML, which I think already includes some of these.
You should link to the appropriate. I'll take a look through your links section and then comment and update today. I do think that as we add test grid bits for some of these subprojects, we should definitely update sigs.yaml with the appropriate section that includes the link to the where people can discover these binary artifacts. Also, with regards to taking a step back for a second, because this crosses over topics, is how are we going to be publishing artifacts for these separate repositories?
I don't really know.
Well, I'll bring that up tomorrow. I'll save that for tomorrow.
It might be away tomorrow. So which artifacts do you mean? Can you explain, please?
The different cluster API controllers and whatnot. There's container artifacts for all of those, as well as integration for cluster cuddle. So those artifacts need to be published by somebody with some key that says they're good. So when randos take it off the interwebs, it isn't some botnet virus.
Yeah, so maybe Robert can comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we expect that the providers to be published as containers, right? So I think the missing part is that last piece you were talking about, which is, so provider X creates a container, says this is the container we should be using, or this is the container we should be using for this specific release. And how do we link that into what's actually being used, right? Where's sort of the mapping there?
Yeah, there needs to be some level of provenance.
As for the links to test grid, I'm looking at the charter template, and I don't see anywhere in there where we would be linking off to test grid. It feels like that.
Oh, no, not in the charter. I was talking about the sigs.yaml.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's
for discoverability.
More reasonable. Okay, so yeah, it sounds like we also have an action item to update sigs.yaml as well. Is there, Tim, you suggested doing that after updating the charter. Is there any reason not to just do that now?
You could do the sub-project updates with test grid now.
Yeah, I think we should do that now. I'll send a PR for that unless you want to, Livermore.
is it okay if I leave the 6.yaml to you guys? Because I'm not sure about all the details there.
Yeah, I'll take a pass at that and send out a PR.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else about the charter? Summary is please go take a look at the doc if you have comments. Lumir is going to create a PR from the doc maybe next Monday. We will link to that PR during next week's meeting notes. Tell people to put any final comments on the PR, and then we'll send it out for review. All right. Next, P1 Beta 1 changes for config.
If folks haven't seen the tracking issue from Fabrizio, as well as the V1 Beta 1 doc, which she's currently updating, Liz, Fabrizio, and I had sat down and talked about in more detail about what the changes are. All of them kind of make sense, but they are, yet again, another transition towards getting ourselves into a sustainable path for configuration for kubeadm. So comments and feedback are welcome. If you have comments with regards to those changes. Nothing is really earth-shattering, but part of the work is to separate out who owns what, and namely the biggest thing I think is separating out the component configuration details from the kubeadm config. This will also allow for better vendoring for folks who would like to take the configuration from kubeadm and be able to vendor it inside of their repository. This is useful for a lot of people who do tools and automation. The problem currently with the current vendoring apparatus of the master config is that whenever you touch something that touches component config, you swallow the whole universe of Kubernetes, or a good chunk of it. That's just the depth graph problem of many things inside of Kubernetes. And that's part of what Lucas's proposal is, to push component config into the staging repository. So all of that's good work, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So the first part of separating out the dependencies inside of kubeadm is the work we would like to accomplish in a near term.
We should perhaps link to the proposal. I'm looking for the link right now.
Sure, I have the link handy. I'll put it in the doc.
So in terms of the config, I saw an issue from Andy Goldstein today. He said that he wants the core DNS image to be configurable. I don't think we have that in the latest config, and I wanted to Fabrizio to comment on that, but I don't see him in the meeting.
That one we need to suss out too as well. That's a separate request. Yeah. The meta topic for that piece is if people do air-gapped environments, or if a provider wants to be able to give you some level of provenance, having that configurable as a default location with tag overrides to say it comes from registry X with tag override B. We want to be able to enable those facilities, because sometimes you don't want the provenance to look like it's the same thing but coming from a different registry. You want to make sure that it says .vendor .something, right? So that way it's clear to providers as well as to people who have air-gapped environments. If they're rebuilding things, they have a mechanism by which to do that.
It's also a powerful way to tackle regressions. Like if a new version of the image is broken, we can go back to the previous one.
Yeah, exactly. So if a person has a problem too, intermittently on a next major version, because we kind of lump it all together. So version 1.11.x has all of these lumped versions together, including some of the core components, core add-ons. I'll talk about that with Fabrizio too offline. I know he's working offline on some of this stuff.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks for linking the doc there, Tim. I also linked in the tracking issue as well, if people want to find that and follow along. All right, next we have CRI plus SIG node.
So I think this crosses over with Justin's last topic there, is that the version that is currently vendored as supported for Kubernetes is old. It's 1703 was the latest version, and there have been sec updates and other fixes that have occurred asynchronously, but Docker traditionally does not do back patches for some of those issues. That's one meta point, but the next point is that we are starting to slowly transition some of the CRI bits to be more first class. But I think in order for that to occur, we need to coordinate with testing and SIG node to get those pieces in some level of automation that actually is representable to the user and scalable to testing, that doesn't make them test every single CRI under the sun, which could be many. But we need to have some baseline bar of validation. So this is kind of a PSA that I'm going to go talk with SIG node. We know about this problem. We talked about it, I think, a couple times within the SIG, but we don't typically have opinions on one CRI versus the other. We just need to basically hook up all the automation so that way it's actually validated from end to end.
Yeah, and people want different CRIs all the time. Like they are submitting containerd issues, and we don't have any tests, or I have never tested containerd in the first place, so I don't know how to respond to the users.
Yeah, and there's no automation for kubeadm deployments with containerd. There's separate containerd tests, but they're node-specific tests. They're not end-to-end. Here, I'm deploying an entire cluster and then standing up, containerd in that stack.
Yeah,
I think there are end-to-end deployments. They're just not with kubeadm.
Yeah, but that's another problem, right? Like, what is the deployment artifact they're using to stand this all up?
I was thinking, where is this document, by the way, or the blog post that outlines that like the whole Kubernetes currently supports these other CRIs? Is there a link for that?
I'd have to dig it up for you, but I can put an action item in the doc for me and then at me, and I'll dig it up for you. But there was a blog post about containerd is like fully supported. That was a while ago.
Yeah, one problem with the blog post is that it's already in history. Like people have already read it and went away, and we should probably document somewhere that support is experimental for these CRIs.
I'll talk about that with SIG node.
Okay.
I think that's all I have on that topic.
Okay, Justin, did you want to sort of continue that forward into your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. The sort of thing which prompted this was COPS, as we talked about previously, sort of does take an opinion on everything, right? So like COPS is a complete set of, or offers you sets of things, and I was looking at adding support for Ubuntu 18.04, which is the latest LTS. 16.04, we're no longer past our EDEs because we changed them, and so that's why I was doing that. But our tested or verified or recommended, whatever the word is, versions of Docker for Kubernetes 1.11, there is no official Docker package that runs on 18.04. And I think this sort of gets into which SIG or which group is it that sort of is responsible for putting all of this together and making sure that there exists a working configuration. And to me, that is SIG.
I think that is this SIG,
yeah.
But I think some other people within other SIGs have kind of jumped the gun with regards to some of the other bits. But I don't know how we do enforcement, right? Like, how do we say, we are going to test this stack version across the whole?
Well, I think that's we just do that, right? So I think it's more the harder bit, in my opinion, is figuring out which things we are going to which slices we are going to test and how we avoid doing that in COPS and in KubeADM and in cluster-CTL and in everything else, right? Because that is not a good use of everyone's time. But I mean, I think we can certainly agree in the meantime, like how I don't really want to go into like, with regards to the particular question that I asked, the like Docker thing, I think a good option might be to just install from the bare binaries rather than the package. But I guess the question is like, how are we going to, should we choose configurations and try to get them under testing, whether it's with COPS or KubeADM, and try to converge on those sort of things as a SIG?
I do think we need to talk with SIG Node, because they do a whole vetting process for CRIs, and it is non-trivial. And they usually even like publish almost like a white paper that came along with it that talked about, here are the performance implications, here are the artifacts that we've seen, here's how the Delta has applied, because history has taught us in the past, many moons ago, the younger version of Docker had a tendency to break things asynchronously. So we want to make sure that we do our due diligence prior to making a choice for a pick of a common substrate.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I guess my viewpoint is that like SIG Node looks more narrowly at, let's say, Docker, for example, and this SIG looks at combining all the various pieces together, right? So this SIG will pull in the cloud provider and the cloud controller and make sure that they all work together, which hopefully, you know, we can pass off most of the hard work of CRI validation to SIG Node, and then it's more like, oh, we've got the flags wrong, that sort of level of complexity, I hope. That would make our lives better, right? But I guess figuring out, it would be great, I guess this can feed into tomorrow's discussion, but figuring out how we decide what a slice is that we want to test. And like today we'll have to test it in N different ways. And if we could get to being able to test it in one way, that would, or being able to express that in one way at least, that would make everyone's lives better.
I absolutely think that we should take ownership stake on the slice of components for a given version and make sure that we have consistency across version A to version B, because it's in our best interests, and it gets testing cycles done, and it avoids the NP hard complexity that we could find ourselves in if we don't.
Well, yeah, I agree. And yeah, so should we discuss that more tomorrow then, I guess, in the cluster API with regards to that, or should we discuss that more here?
I think this is more SIG specific. Like this cuts across everybody. So I think we can bring it up in both places, which would probably be good. But I'm going to go to SIG Node, and I almost recommend that you possibly go there too to discuss this topic. What?
Is it this afternoon?
It is immediately after this meeting.
Even easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I want to come back to something that you guys both said earlier and sort of reiterate. This goes back to the SIG Charter, the position that, do we believe that our SIG is sort of the integration point for the other pieces, you know, the control plane components, the node components, et cetera, to sort of validate the overall configuration that we as a community want to support for like a Kubernetes release?
I would say yes, except what you said, to validate. And I think that's the actual infrastructure of validation, I think falls on the SIG testing. But the work to create those tests, I think falls on us.
Well, not just the tests, but the configurations too, right? So we say, we're going to ship 1.12. For 1.12, we recommend using this version of Ubuntu with this version of Docker. We have to go coordinate with SIG Node to choose all of those different things on the node side. You know, and on the control plane side, these flags, right? And we have to go talk with the different SIGs that own the control plane binaries to figure out which flags should be passed on every release. And I think we do a lot of that already with KubeADM, and we look at what flags we should pass and how those change over time. And so I think that the sort of the new thing that I'm hearing people discuss today is, in addition to what we've been doing with KubeADM in terms of determining how we can figure things on top of nodes that already exist, it's almost sort of akin to the cluster API, which is, okay, now we're going to own the machines as well, and we're going to own you know, sort of the OS and the CRI as sort of part of the whole puzzle. And I think with KubeADM, we maybe needed implicitly, we're kind of needing to do that anyway, because we had to have something under KubeADM to actually run our tests against, and that was what was validated, which I think is what Tim was sort of pointing out earlier. but maybe we just need to be more explicit about that.
I agree with that. I think it's a coordination effort, right? We're not going to do the CRI validation, but we're going to raise an issue with SIG node, for example, if the versions they're validating aren't running on a popular OS type thing.
Right. So it seems like something that would be really good to capture in the SIG charter. I don't know if there's part of the template that is like, I know that there's a part for the things that are out of scope, but is there a part for like things that you do that kind of cut across other groups?
Yes.
Like where is the coordination point? Okay.
Yep, there is one.
Cool.
Yeah. So I've already added like a point into the charter that we don't deal with node-specific aspects, node-specific problems. So the CRI validation is clearly in the space of SIG node, and we should perhaps like trigger the process of validating 18.03.
Yeah, I think what Justin's point was is that we aren't going to try to validate a CRI, but what we're going to do is to go to SIG node and say, hey, SIG node, like the version of the CRI that you're telling people they should use doesn't actually run on any of the OSs that people want to use. We have some dissonance there. Can we figure out how to rectify that? Right? As we have maybe like a higher level global view of how all the pieces fit together. And what they're looking at is more down in the weeds of like, we got this CRI working, right? And we say like, well, maybe we need to get this other CRI working.
Yeah, definitely. I was also going to ask the question if the whole Docker command line is going to be renamed to Moby, which is going to break a lot of stuff.
I think the goal from a lot of our perspective is to use CRI tool for most everything and to try to move that as quickly as we can to getting first class. Well, we'll have to exercise jurisprudence, but yes, we would like to use CRI tool for most of the things we can, as long as we get CRI tool in a state that is a little bit more baked. Because right now it's very 1/4 baked, half baked. I don't know how baked that is.
80%.
Well, so on the note of keeping up with all the different versions and validating them and whatnot, what I remember from discussing this problem with SIG-Node is that they're interested in trying to push some of that off onto the different, vendors of the CRI. Kind of right now, they sort of need to handle Docker and Docker Shim, but I think long term they'd even like to kind of push some of that towards Docker and can say, look, you want people to run Kubernetes with this, validate it, make sure it works. So that even they don't have to scale out to, in different CRIs of like continually keeping up and recommending them and just say, you can ask the vendor what they recommend.
So this is like this weird state space where it crosses over SIG cluster lifecycle through SIG node into policy of what it means to be a supported version. So like this almost cuts into SIG Arch and steering for that matter to like, what does it mean to say you're supported, right? Like, there needs to be some level of guarantees from the consumer besides just conformance that allows the provider to say like XYZ is a supported thing for Kubernetes ABC.
So I also remember them saying that it's not Kubernetes saying that this one is supported, like that we like allowed to post or something, but it's the vendor saying, okay, our integration is available now. And the only way that it's like guaranteed fully supported is if like the complete package, including the CRI, is conformance tested.
Yes.
Yeah, we need a stamp on a bunch of features that tells Kubernetes is compatible with all of these, and we can show this to the users that file reports. Because if it's not supported, we cannot provide you full feedback.
That is exactly what we need, because without it, we get stuck in this NP hard complexity problem where people are installing rando stuff, and we're stuck with all the support burden.
But hopefully we can integrate against the interface, the CRI, and let's say Kubernetes supports CRI, and if your CRI is not behaving properly, that's go talk to the vendor.
Well, at some point, we need to have kind of a baseline of where do we even start testing from to validate. We need a baseline level of validation before we can even have kind of conformance tests on distributed bits.
What baseline are you not seeing?
Well, I'm just saying we need to start from some baseline, and right now that's Docker and Docker Shin, but if we're moving away from that, we still need to have something that we're using as a baseline for end-to-end testing for validation to even be able to ship.
Right, and they talk about they're in a similar place where they're not super. I think they're not super interested in having to like maintain, an official Docker one, because that puts them in sort of awkward place with the other CRIs. But for the moment, like, they can't afford to break everything. So I think we just need to push them that, okay, you're supporting one, it's gotten pretty old. Can we support something newer? But even that one, I think their intention is that long term that would just become sort of like another vendor CRI, and that like the vendor really ought to be doing that.
I mean, I think that if we don't have end-to-end tests for something, it's not supported, and should be the baseline. I'm not sure if this is like the core of the discussion here.
Well, that's policy, right? Like, you need to have some policy if you want to be part of saying your supported configuration. You need to have some point to say that it's been validated, right?
Well, I mean, supported is a tricky word, because we don't technically, like, you can't phone me up and say, hey, you validated COPS and I'm going to help you. You got to help me, Justin, right? You can hit me on Slack, but there's no guarantees, right? And I think we have the conformance test, which is a stamp. I think what we want, I think one approach could be that we come up with one or a few slices that we ourselves test, and ideally they pass conformance, or hopefully they pass conformance, and that those are then verified if not supported, right? But we have the challenge, and I think this came up on the Twitter this weekend, right, is that it's hard to put the open source Kubernetes. We want to still be a workable thing, right? It shouldn't be that you have to use a commercial certified distribution of Kubernetes in order to get Kubernetes to work. It should be that open source Kubernetes has an answer, and then you go to a commercial vendor if you want support. And so I would love to see us come up with a slice that we can get through the certification testing and have at least that guarantee for people.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a really good plan. I've seen a few like kind of small ones, but having like a sort of official one could be really nice.
I'll bring up that there's a cross-cloud CI team that's meeting in a little more than an hour that does from the CNCF CI testing of Kubernetes. And from a perspective of harmonizing efforts, it might be worthwhile to think what that group could do for the certification and validation efforts.
All talked out.
I think so. I did have maybe a meta topic, but I'll bring it up tomorrow with regards to cluster API and on-prem stuff.
Sounds good. With that, we are at the end of the agenda. Does anyone else have things they want to discuss in the last few minutes? Going once, going twice. All right, thank you everyone for coming. We will see you all again either tomorrow or next week. Have a great week. Bye.